Hi all, you are on the channel World of Military Stories. Today we will talk about the Battle of Culloden, and so we begin. This battle was the last in a series of battles, called the Jacobite Wars, by the Scots who supported the Stuart dynasty in the struggle for the English crown. It was the last major battle in the British Isles, and at the same time gave rise to the destruction of the clan system of the Scottish Highlanders and the death of good old Scotland. Background of the battle, how it all began. In 1689, after the expulsion to France of James the Second English and the Seventh Scottish, the thrones of both nations passed from the Roman Catholic House of Stuart to the Protestant House of Orange under James's eldest daughter, Mary II, and her husband, the Dutch-born William III of Orange. In 1702, after their death, the crown passed to Mary's sister Anne, who was considered the last monarch of the House of Stuart. In 1707, the Parliaments of England and Scotland, by joint acts, united the two countries into the Kingdom of Great Britain. When Anne died without an heir in 1714, the kingdom passed to the House of Hanover under the rule of her German cousin George I, a Protestant relative. Many Scots and English demanded the restoration of the Stuart line. As a result, the Jacobites, supporters of the Stuarts, raised two failed rebellions in Scotland in 1715 and 1719. France, then at war with England in the War of the Austrian Succession, hatched a plot to invade the British Isles. In early 1744, Louis XV supported the 24-year-old handsome Prince Charles Edward Stuart, the eldest son of the exiled King James III, Francis Edward Stuart, in his claim to the united throne of England and Scotland. But in February 1744, a strong storm prevented the invasion. In July 1745, the prince nevertheless landed on Scottish soil. The practical Scots did not really believe in the success of his undertaking, but the brilliant victories at Preston Pans and Falkirk provided the prince with an influx of volunteers from the Highland clans. However, the uprising did not receive wide support. The Highlanders felt uncomfortable on the English plain. The English Jacobites for the most part remained on the sidelines. The Scots retreated to their territory. An experienced general, Prince William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland and son of King George II, led the English forces. He spent the remainder of the winter and early spring at Aberdeen, regrouping his army and adding some 5,000 Hessian mercenaries to it. Meanwhile, when handsome Prince Charlie was running out of money and food, the 9,000-strong Cumberland army, without the Hessians, moved west to the Jacobite stronghold at Inverness and camped near Nairn on April 15. The Jacobites reached Drunmossy Moor, near Culloden, about 12 miles from Nairn. There, on the advice of his adjutant, Charlie decided to take up position for battle. By that time, his men were so weakened and hungry that, by some estimates, a third of the Jacobite army had scattered in search of food. Meanwhile, the well-supplied English troops spent the day feasting and drinking. The Jacobite commanders decided to use the same tactics that brought them victory at Preston Pans, a flanking attack at dawn. Moving over rough terrain to avoid the British sentries, the hungry rebels trudged through the difficult terrain for several hours, but by dawn they were still not in position. Exhausted and disorganized, they had to return. Many fell asleep. Others went in search of food, and on April 16, 1746 at 10:30 am, Scottish pickets noticed the approaching British 9,000 fighters, on the side of which was the Campbell clan. Another hour was spent building the Scottish battle line. There were a little more than 5,000 people in their ranks, with the virtual absence of artillery. There were 10 cannons and 10 mortars, but most of the artillerymen fled from hunger. The first line consisted of the Highlanders, the second, the English Jacobites, the Lowland Scots, the Irish Brigade and the French mercenaries. Approximately 500 yards separated the opponents. Between them lay swampy soil, completely unsuitable for a mountain attack. Torrential rain and sleet beat right in the face of the rebel army. The Royal Artillery opened fire at about 1 in the afternoon. At this point, the stormy weather stopped. The ranks of the rebels were rapidly thinning, but the prince did not give the order to attack. History does not definitively know who gave the order to attack: Prince Charlie, who retreated after his servant's head was blown off by a cannonball, or Donald Cameron of Lochiel, who stood in the center, or Lord George Murray on the Jacobite right. In any case, the Highlanders finally rushed to the attack. The swampy middle of the heath, covered with heather, slowed down the advance, which fell under the volleys of British buckshot. About 80 paces from the British position, the Highlanders stopped to fire their muskets, threw them aside, raised their claymores, and rushed at the enemy with shouts. The 4th and 37th Infantry Regiments of the British Army took the brunt of the blow. The soldiers of the first rank thrust their bayonets into the attacking rebels on the right. aiming in the direction where the bodies of the Scots were not protected by targ shields. The slashing redcoats Highlanders partially broke through the first line, only to be trapped between the first and second lines. While one British regiment moved to plug the gap, two others counter-attacked, and the Highlanders were flanked with fire. The dragoons cut off their retreat. Meanwhile, the centre and left of the straggler Jacobite line, slowed down by the swampy terrain and the British guns, and discouraged by the sight of the disintegrating right flank, began to fall back without fighting. Finally, the Royal Cavalry and the remaining dragoons stepped in. The Scottish cavalry, only 150 fighters, could not prevent this. The massacre began, but the Irish Brigade, acting coolly and clearly, covered the fleeing Jacobites with fire. In less than an hour of fierce fighting, over 1,500 of Prince Charlie's fighters were killed or wounded, and 376 were captured. Cumberland's losses were 50 killed and less than 300 wounded. After the victory at Culloden, the British launched repressions against the mountain clans, and they forbade wearing tartans. Rebellious lords were deprived of their lands. Entire communities of tenant mountaineers were evicted to the plains. Thousands were thrown into prison. Hundreds were executed. Handsome Prince Charlie fled to the Hebrides. The British put a price on his head. However, no one betrayed him. In mid-September 1746, on a French ship, he sailed to France. He never returned to Scotland and died in Rome on January 31, 1788.